Many years ago, on a trip through northern France, I will never forget the time I visited the famous Chartres Cathedral. The great old building under lumpy European grey skies appeared dirty and sullen in its appearance. The windows looked dark and dreary from the outside, and I stood looking at them, and I was disappointed, for I had heard so much about the famous stained glass windows of this cathedral. But then the group that I was travelling with made their way inside the cathedral. And then what a transformation. Even though there was little sunlight that filtered through the stained glass, I've never seen such a rich assemblage of blues and reds and greens and yellows and all the colours of the rainbow. The cathedral, built between 1190 and 1220, contained 167 stained glass windows, some of them, of course, dating back to the Middle Ages. The two north and south rose windows just took your breath away. And on the inside, the cathedral was a totally different place from what one saw on the outside. In the ancient world, they had the spatial concept called the golden mean, which were the ideal measurements for anything that you were about to build. They were the ascending numbers, 1, 3, 5, and 8, if you're a mathematician, which also reflect the dimensions in the mythical story of Noah and the Ark. Each number is 1.6 times larger than the previous one and is now called by mathematicians the Fibonacci sequence. The Egyptian Great Pyramid, for example, has its base and height ratio follows this sequence. And if those of you who have been to Greece, to Athens, and seen the Greek Parthenon, with its base to column spacing, it embodies the same proportions. Professor J.H. van der Berg, the pioneer of phenomenological psychology, that's a hard word to say on a Sunday morning, it tells the story of going back to the village that he had grown up in. He was disappointed at finding so little that he could recognise in the village because many changes had taken place. He then followed the road that he had taken daily on his way to school. And at one point, there was a wall, which was still there, and running along the wall was a crack into which, as a child, he put his finger into it. And now, as an adult, as he bent down to put his finger in the crack once again, it was as if his finger was the conduit to his memory, recorded long ago. And that little crack in the wall was a place that was forever attached to his person. I had a similar experience when in 1988 I visited the town where I was born in the UK. The path that I walked to Ellington Primary School, I went down a little laneway which had a very high brick wall, which I could not see over as a child. On the other side of the laneway were bushes, so that I felt I was walking down a tunnel. And as I walked the same path as an adult, I suddenly realised that I could see over the wall. But the wall was still there, etched into the memory bank of my brain from a small child. In the mythological story of creation in Genesis, the writer places the earthman, Adam, in the Garden of Eden. It was a place for him. This was a peaceful place where he lived in harmonious familiarity with nature and with God. It was a place of perfection where no anxiety intruded to make the earth man want to leave it. But then the human creatures opened their minds to disobedience, and they were driven out of the garden to become wanderers, creatures with no place. The march of human history had begun. And in Genesis 4, we encounter the story of the murder of Cain by Abel. The other way around, the murder of Abel by Cain. And God said to Cain, "You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." And so Cain became a person with no place. Countries, of course, have their sacred places. A number of years ago, I stood on the beach at Gallipoli and tried to imagine what it would be like for the Anzacs, those troops landing there in April 1915. And it felt like a sacred place, even though it was in Turkey for Australians and New Zealanders. I spent many years when I was chaplain at Wesley College working with Indigenous students in the Kimberley. And I've had the privilege to see so many sacred places, springs, rocks, trees, and caves that tourists are unable to see. And I was taken there by Aboriginal elders, and I have come to appreciate how important place is to Indigenous people, because you see there's a direct correlation between place and identity, inextricably bound to one another. Place and who you are, terribly important. We may wonder, of course, why immigrants to our country congregate in certain suburbs and places. It is because of the relationship between place and identity. It happens all over the world. Go to London and you see parts of London which they call Kangaroo Land because you see so many Australians there. And you may then understand why displacement, forced or voluntary, can be so traumatic for individuals and groups. To lose the place where you were born and grew up and to be moved to another place can be very traumatic for many people. And perhaps it helps us to understand and explain why so many people who are incarcerated on Manus Island or Nauru suffer from such mental health problems, for both sides of politics say there is no place for you here. I can remember as a small boy coming with my parents and my brother, who's here this morning. He's the guy with the tat on the back of his head. As migrants to Australia in the post-war migration scheme, 10-pound POMs we were called. My parents and my brother got off the ship in Sydney, and we were packed onto a train to take us to a migrant camp in Bathurst, which was an old army camp from World War II. We were mixed in with Greeks, Italians, Germans, Poles, Yugoslavs, and Czechs. All of us lost and displaced, trying to find a place where we could settle down, where we could be ourselves, and where we could make some kind of contribution to this new land that we had come to. The camp was 10 miles outside Bathurst, so the experience of space was also intimidating to us, newcomers to this land. You could also imagine the fights that occurred as people were so stressed in this melting pot of humanity. In the summer of 1940, after the fall of France, Switzerland found herself entirely surrounded by the armies of Hitler and Mussolini. A wind of panic and defeatism swept the country, and people said, "What's the use of trying to defend ourselves?" And then General Guisan gathered all of his senior officers to a special field on the 25th of July 1940 so that they could renew the old oath of resistance to the death of all invaders made in 1291 by the founders of the Confederation. In choosing that symbolic place, the general was touching the soul of the whole nation of Switzerland and restoring its confidence and its resolve. Over the years, I've talked with many people who have felt that they didn't belong to their family anymore, for example. Whether it was a change in their values or in their relationships, but they expressed that they felt out of place in their own families. I've spoken with many ministers who felt they didn't have a place anymore in their churches. Either they felt a lack of connectedness theologically with their church or tradition, or there had been a conflict in the congregation and they felt it was time to move on. As a school chaplain, I've sat with students over the years who've been sitting on their own, eating lunch, scorned by all their fellow students. And during the conversation, I would say to them that they felt they didn't belong at the school. But Mum and Dad wanted them to go to this school, so they felt out of place. And there are many people who feel that they can't belong to the church anymore, either through unresolved conflicts, theology that isn't relevant any longer, or they've lost the sense of community that they once felt with a particular congregation. According to the reading from Hebrews today, which I suddenly remembered was the wrong reading, so forgive me, people. Samuel, it records, we were not only looking for a place for ourselves, but they were also looking for a place for God, the divine mystery. And it's part of human nature that we want to localize God. We want to put him or her or it in a place. Primitive and early religions and later mythologies localized the gods in streams and rivers and trees and rocks and mountains and stars. And the Israelites evolved into monotheism in place of the multitudes of gods located in many places. But they still felt the need for a place, a meeting place where they could find God and worship him. And on Mount Sinai, God, or Yahweh as he was called, has given Moses instructions for the making of an ark, a sacred object which contained the covenant that God had made with the Israelites. And the ark was portable. The poles of the acacia wood overlaid with gold, and it was always ready to be carried by the Israelites if they were threatened or in trouble. And so in this passage from 2 Samuel, the Israelites have settled into the promised land and become, under King David, a powerful nation. And David's ambition is to build a temple in place of the nomadic art of the desert and to finally find a place for God. But David, for some reason, didn't build the temple. That was left to his son Solomon. The early Christian Congregationalists here in Melbourne wanted to build a place where they felt they could worship God. This church, St. Michael's. For some Christians, God is only available at 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. The problem then with localising God to a place is that it leads to strife and argument and conflict. I remember visiting the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, and the Armenian Christians couldn't even change a light globe in the church without the permission of the Greek Orthodox monks. trying to localize the divine in one place. And if you've been to Jerusalem and visited the Dome of the Rock, the mosque built on exactly the same spot where the Jewish temple was built and then destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD, you can appreciate why such conflicts still pertain to this day. And in Mark 6, in the Gospel reading, we find that Jesus leads his disciples into a place of retreat from the pressures of the crowd, a place of rest and recuperation. And we need the psychological space and place to find a retreat and peace. Even Jesus experienced the stress and anxiety of the crowd and needed to find space and a place where he could be psychologically renewed. In the busyness of our lives, we've come to this place today. We've witnessed the baptisms of Franklin and Jacob, and I hope that they and their families will always remember St. Michael's as the place in which their children's baptisms occurred. And we can recognise, as we have worshipped here today, that God, the divine mystery, is bigger than any building in which we might try to localise that presence. And perhaps today, after this service, you might join Karen in her meditation to find that place, a retreat that you are looking for in the midst of a busy world. Our blessing. Divine presence, as we part and go our different ways, it is our desire that you will give us each in our own way the passion for living and loving, the courage for daring and hoping, the freedom for growing and changing, the capacity for giving and receiving, the humility for learning, the tenderness for understanding, the strength for enduring, the trust for believing. And may your grace and your peace, which is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of all that makes life whole, be with us today and always. Amen.